Orientalism tries to answer the question of why, when we think of the Middle East, for example, we have a preconceived notion of what kind of people live there, what they believe, how they act, even though we may never have been there or indeed even met anyone from there. More generally, Orientalism asks, how do we come to understand people, strangers, who look different to us by virtue of the color of their skin? The central argument of Orientalism is that the way we acquire this knowledge is not innocent or objective, but the end result of a process that reflects certain interests. That is, it is highly motivated. Specifically, Said argues that the way the West, Europe and the US, looks at the countries and peoples of the Middle East is through a lens that distorts the actual reality of those places and those people. He calls this lens through which we view that part of the world Orientalism, a framework that we use to understand the unfamiliar and the strange, to make the peoples of the Middle East appear different and threatening. Professor Said's contribution to how we understand this general process of what we could call stereotyping has been immense. The aim of this program is to explore these issues through an interview with him.
If somebody, let's say in the 1850s or 60s in Paris or London, wished to talk about or read about India or Egypt or Syria, there would be very little chance for that person to simply address the subject, as we like to think, in a kind of free and creative way. A great deal of writing had gone before, and this writing was an organized form of writing, like an organized science, you know, what I've called Orientalism. And it seemed to me that there was a kind of repertory of images that kept coming up, you know, the sensual woman who's there to be sort of used by the man. The East is a kind of mysterious place full of secrets and monsters. You know, the marvels of the East was a phrase that was used. And the more I looked, the more I saw that this was really quite consistent with itself. You know, it had very little to do with people who had actually been there. And even if they had been there wasn't much modification. In other words, you didn't get what you could call realistic representations of the Orient, either in literature or in painting or in music or any of the arts. And this extended even further into descriptions of the Arabs by experts, you know, people who had studied them. And I noticed that even in the 20th century, some of the same images that you found in the 19th century, amongst scholars like Edward William Lane, who wrote his book on the modern Egyptians in the early 1830s, and then you read somebody in the 1920s, and they're more or less saying the same thing. So there develops a kind of image of the timeless Orient, as if the Orient, unlike the West, doesn't develop, it stays the same. And that's one of the problems with Orientalism, is it creates an image outside of history, of something that is placid and still and, you know, eternal, which is simply contradicted by the facts of history. You see, so that's in that one sense, it's a creation of you might say an ideal other for Europe.
Professor Said's analysis of Orientalism isn't just a description of its content, but a sustained argument for why it looks the way it does. It's an examination of the quite concrete historical and institutional context that creates it. Specifically, Said locates the construction of Orientalism within the history of imperial conquest. As empires spread across the globe, historically the British and the French have been the most important in terms of the East. They conquer not only militarily, but also what we could call ideologically. The question for these empires is, how do we understand the natives that we are encountering so we can conquer and subdue them easier? This process of using large abstract categories to explain people who look different, whose skin is a different color, has been going on for a long time, as far back as there has been contact between different cultures and peoples. But Orientalism makes this general process more formal in that it presents itself as objective knowledge. Said identifies Napoleon's conquest of Egypt in 1798 as marking a new kind of imperial and colonial conquest that inaugurates the project of Orientalism.
There was a kind of break that occurred after Napoleon came to Egypt in 1798. I think it's the first really important modern imperial expedition. So he invades the place, but he doesn't invade it the way the Spaniards invaded the New World, looking for loot. He comes instead with an enormous army of soldiers, but also scientists, botanists, architects, philologists, biologists, historians, whose job it was to record Egypt in every conceivable way and produce a kind of scientific survey of Egypt, which was designed not for the Egyptian, but for the European. And, of course, what strikes you, first of all, about the volumes that they produced is their enormous size. They're a meter square. And all across them is written the power and prestige of a modern European country that can do to the Egyptians what the Egyptians cannot do to the French. I mean, there's no comparable Egyptian survey of France. To produce knowledge, you have to have the power to be there and to see in expert ways things that the natives themselves can't see.